Welcome, folks. As people start to trickle in today, we're going to start off by playing the ULI Toronto's new membership video. So enjoy while everyone gets settled. Welcome again.
One of the staff members at ULI Toronto came to speak at Ryerson University, and I just thought, this is a great way to network and to meet people and to learn more about my city as well, because they put on such great programming.
To me, ULI has been a crucial part of my career development. 4 years ago in Kensington Market, there was a ULI walking tour where I met a senior city planner, and we developed a strong working relationship.
That's a great thing about ULI, is the opportunity to be with like-minded people in the industry. I've personally hired people from running into them at ULI and led to a conversation, and it grew into an opportunity to join our company.
There are just so many opportunities for people of all ages to get involved as volunteers or just to attend the events and get involved.
Great about ULI is if there's that someone you've been wanting to meet and you haven't had the opportunity to do so, the roster of members is open. Take a look at who the members are. If that person's on the list, ask one of the ULI staff and they will make the introduction.
Conversations that are happening, everything from the technology side of the business and incorporating UTech into development and urban planning.
That's rare to have that kind of an entity that can convene conversations from a whole variety of perspectives so that we can kind of push and challenge each other to think a little differently about the solutions that might make a lot of sense.
Now that I've been a part of ULI for 7 years and then I volunteered for ULI, I hardly go by without going to an event and not knowing one person. And sometimes I actually find that there isn't enough time during the network portion of an event to talk to everybody that I know there.
Join ULI to connect with people in the industry, to grow your career, and to give back.
Great. So hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Laura Sellers. I am a partner at Entro and the co-chair of the ULI Outreach Committee. Welcome to the program, everyone. As Toronto, the Toronto region is a Toronto-based organization. We want to acknowledge the land that we are meeting on virtually today, of course, but is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishwaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. We'd also like to acknowledge and honor those who came here involuntarily, particularly those who are descendant from those brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, I recommend a program that ULI hosted with Shared Path over the past summer. 13,000 years of Indigenous history in the GTA and why it matters to planning and development, and most recently, Whose Land and Whose Law. And the links for both of those events will be posted in the chat. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. So everyone will be muted throughout the session to ensure there are no audio interferences. Closed captioning is available for the session. There may be a slight delay and might not be 100% accurate, so please be patient. If you have any questions for speakers, please use the Q&A function and upvote questions by pressing the thumbs up button. The session is being recorded, and you'll be sent a link following the session. If you'd like to take the conversation online, please use the handle at ULI Toronto or with the hashtag #AskGreatQuestions. I'd also like to take a moment to extend a sincere appreciation to our annual sponsors. Today's event and all of the other ULI programming would not be possible without their support. So on behalf of ULI, I'd like to thank them for their continued support. ULI relies on the support of our sponsors to provide quality programming and to help drive our mission of creating and sustaining thriving communities. So to all of them, we say thank you very much. As co-chair of the ULI Outreach Committee, I'm excited to present today's session. It branches off after a 2-day charrette, or what we like to call a technical advisory panel, that we hosted last December. The main outputs of that TAP or charrette is a report which was included in the marketing of today's event, and we'll also post a link to it in the chat box. It's an extension of the report, so today we'll be building off that, as well as welcoming community stakeholders who will be introduced shortly. We have a lot to cover, so I'll turn it over to the main driver of this TAP and the author of the report, who also will present today, Dina Grazer. So Dina specializes in urban projects that build and engage communities. She has worked extensively in the emerging field of community benefits, consulting for governments, foundations, and private companies on how to maximize infrastructure and development to bring broader social and economic benefits to local communities. Between 2016 and 2018, she was the project director for the National Housing Collaborative, a group of housing stakeholders from across Canada whose significant policy proposals influenced the National Housing Strategy. Prior to that, she was Director, Community and Stakeholder Relations at Metrolinx, a communications lawyer, a planning activist, and co-founder of People Plan Toronto, and a successful producer of arts and events. She is currently chair of the board of directors of the Toronto Arts Council. Thank you, Dina, so much for your enthusiasm on this, and welcome. Take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dina.
Great. And is the screen up?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, ULI. And thanks to everybody on the panel and in the audience for being here today. My interest in this subject grows out of two areas that I've worked a lot in over the past couple of years, as Laura has noted. The first is community benefits. I've spent a lot of time looking at how large infrastructure and development projects can generate greater social and economic returns for local communities. And the second is housing. I was involved with the National Housing Collaborative, which focused on housing affordability primarily for low and moderate income renter households. A couple of years ago, I also had the opportunity to do some work with Sidewalk Labs, which itself was exploring a range of really interesting approaches to housing, including some of the models that we'll talk about today. So I've been thinking a lot about communities, about affordability, and about space, which takes me to the context behind this discussion, which I think you're all probably aware of, but which I think bears some acknowledging. There's really three factors that lie behind the discussion that we had at the TAP. The first is obviously the rising cost of real estate, the financialization of housing, the resulting gentrification and displacement. I was gobsmacked when I learned that about 42% of Toronto's apartment stock was sold between 2000 and 2015, and most of it was bought by big real estate investment trusts or REITs, institutional investors, private equity funds, a few big family-owned companies. So we saw a big consolidation of ownership in the market. And it is continuing, right? Real estate, and it's not just residential, although we talk a lot about housing, but it's not just residential, it's also retail and commercial, is becoming just increasingly unaffordable in the city. Add to this, we have a poverty problem with growing income inequality. Low-income neighborhoods almost doubled between 1970 and 2015, according to work that's been done by David Holchansky and the United Way. And the last Vital Signs report that was put out by the Toronto Foundation noted that about 30% of people in Toronto are struggling to pay for essentials. Racialized Canadians, people with disabilities, young people are disproportionately impacted as well. And on top of this, as people with lived experience of poverty have spoken to me about the fact that they have no way to build assets if you're low income. Add on to this the devastating impact of COVID-19 on neighborhoods, which has wiped out a lot of small businesses and has led to really a rethinking of the way that we use commercial spaces. Now, all of this works together because as the pandemic has hit, a lot of small businesses, and in particular retail businesses, have gone south, which if you're a mom and pop landlord makes it really hard for you to pay the mortgage. And in some cases, may mean that you have to sell, and who are you selling to? And it's these large companies, and the cycle starts again. But a lot of the buildings, particularly in suburban communities or low-income communities, they may be smaller, mid-rise, mixed-use buildings, and they might be really important to the fabric of the community. And they might be, if not capital A affordable, then certainly more affordable for local residents. So these three factors together led me to the central question of the TAP, which is it possible to create a vehicle that preserves and expands affordable spaces and gives local residents an opportunity to build wealth? And I want to pause and say, I'm talking not just about housing, but when I say spaces, I'm also thinking about retail, commercial, and community spaces. And thinking about the question of whether you could actually create a company with a mission to buy and operate properties that keeps existing tenants or keeps existing levels of affordability and gives local residents an opportunity to own equity or build equity in those properties, which gives them a stake in their neighborhood and also a way to build wealth. And whether you could try and couple this with the kind of community economic development initiatives that certainly I and lots of other people are familiar with that build local economies and opportunities. So at the TAP, we took 2 mornings. The first morning, we looked at models from at home and abroad. We started actually with presentations from the city of Toronto and the city of Helsinki, which offered 2 very different and contrasting policy contexts. And then we heard from the Open Architecture Alliance, who worked with the community in Little Jamaica last summer, looking at planning issues. Martine Aldridge from Martine & Co. talked about the company she's building in that neighborhood to preserve and build Black ownership. And Martine's on her panel, so I won't say anything more. She'll speak for herself on that. We had Cornerstone Renters Equity, from Cincinnati, which is a nonprofit and offers people who rent in its buildings an opportunity to build equity by getting involved in the governance of the building and participating in the life of the community. NICO, the Neighborhood Investment Company, is a neighborhood REIT, which has purchased 3 buildings in a neighborhood called Echo Park in Los Angeles and is selling shares to local residents at a very low entry cost. You can get in for $100, and then for as little as $5 a month, you can continue to build equity in this portfolio of properties. And then closer to home, Union Sustainable Development Co-op has purchased its first building in Waterloo and is selling shares to residents in Kitchener-Waterloo on the co-op model, which I think most people understand. And there's a whole lot more models out there as well, right? Community bonds, for example, were, I think, introduced to the Toronto market by the Centre for Social Innovation a number of years ago. There are specialized investment funds or pools that people are creating in order to fund new and interesting models. And of course, there are land trusts, which are growing in popularity and have some of the same mandate in terms of preserving community benefits. But I would note that they don't help individuals build equity in the same way as some of these other models do, like a neighborhood REIT or co-op. But what many of these models have in common, and what they're quite express about, is this idea of using real estate to localize and democratize wealth creation around a shared mission of neighborhood equity, and neighborhood equity being both capital E equity and small e equity. The second day of the TAP, we sat back and discussed all of these models. The members of the Kurtner Leadership Group through the Urban Land Institute had prepared scenarios and pro formas for us to look at in terms of 3 different ways of approaching it in the Toronto market. And so we looked at those and we had a variety of discussions. I will say we did not find the yellow brick road. We did not come out with one clear-cut solution to it, but we had a really rich discussion. We talked about the centrality of the neighborhood as a unit in many of these models, the evolution of new asset classes and products, and the importance of community ownership, participation, and governance to preserve neighborhood assets, affordability, culture, and character. I think there was a general agreement that when you're trying to balance social and economic returns, you're looking for investors who are mission aligned, right? Who might be willing to make longer term investments with a slightly lower financial return, given that you've got these greater social and economic and community returns. And we talked about different kinds of collaborations and partnerships and models that can evolve, and also recognizing that communities change, people change. And so therefore models themselves might need to change and evolve over time. I think generally speaking, there's been lots of interest in social purpose real estate in Toronto. There are a lot of people out there right now who are asking these questions: how we engage and involve communities to preserve existing affordable spaces in neighborhoods, how we support local neighborhoods and businesses, help low-income residents build assets, and ultimately, really contribute to this greater goal of building social cohesion and stronger communities. And so I guess the question really is whether there's such a thing as a made in Toronto model that we can invent that might be sustainable and scalable and replicable to get us to those goals. So those are the kinds of things we talked about in the TAP. And with that, I will hand it over to Mark Guslitz, who will introduce and moderate the panel.
Good morning, or good afternoon. Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Guslitz, and I recognize many of the names on the participants list, so many might know who I am. It's one of the few upsides of being old enough to get your COVID shot before everyone else. You also know a lot of people, and welcome to you all, old faces and new. Briefly, my history is as an architect in Canada and the UK. I'm a nonprofit co-op housing developer with the private sector through Daniels, and the public sectors through the City of Toronto and Toronto Community Housing, and an urbanist, looking generally at ways to create more equitable, affordable, and successful urban and suburban communities. And I currently consult on projects within this domain, and I teach a course in socially relevant architecture focused on affordable housing at the Daniels School of Architecture at the U of T. And that's where I am these days. And with us and with me, I have three brilliant people who Dina mentioned earlier, Martine Aldridge, Alex Dow, and Mimi Lau. And before we get into them doing a brief presentation each, I'd like them to introduce themselves briefly, starting with Martine.
Hi, so yes, I'm Martine Aldridge. I'm a CPA. I have a financial reporting and a banking background. And I'm just someone who's been personally investing in real estate for almost 20 years. And so I have a kind of a passion for real estate investing. And with the start of my project that I initiated last year, I've been transitioning more formally into the space more recently.
Great. Alex?
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Dow. I'm the Director of Neighborhood Initiatives at United Way Greater Toronto. So we oversee Peel, Toronto, and York. We have over 270 funded agency partners. And the work that I do at United Way, well, right now is largely about COVID emergency response with the nonprofit sector, but also a number of special projects in low-income neighborhoods across the region.
Thank you. And Mimi.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here. Currently, I'm working on the Golden Mile Community Benefits Project in East Toronto with Working Women Community Centre. Prior to this, I was a health promoter with Halton Region, and that was before becoming a planner. So I'm a little bit of a mixed bag, and currently doing a little bit of public consultation work with Hardy Stevenson and Associates.
Thank you, Mimi. Okay, we're going to get into this now, and we're going to have each of these individuals do a short presentation on their involvement in this particular topic. And we're going to start with Martine. Now, we sent some questions to them. In Martine's case, because she's involved in a very interesting project as well as a company, we asked her to both describe this experience as well as discussing some of the main challenges she may have encountered in this process. So if we may, we'll start with Martine and move on from her to Alex and wrap up with Mimi. Go ahead, Martine.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I guess I should start by saying I'm very happy to be here and to be part of the panel, and I'm looking forward to seeing how Dina's ideas will evolve over time. But just a little bit more background about me so you can see why I started my project. You know, I'm basically the daughter of immigrants from Jamaica. My parents immigrated here from Jamaica in the early 70s. And, you know, in search of the Canadian dream of home ownership, we moved to Aurora when I was very young. But I have many memories of my parents, you know, bringing me down along with my siblings to the area of Little Jamaica to basically purchase our essentials, groceries, you know, for my dad to get his haircut, to buy patties, things like that. So from a young age, I became very familiar with the area of Little Jamaica. So I'm one of many people in the West Indian community, the Caribbean community, who have a love and a fondness for this area. So I was focusing when I started my project on a little strip of Eglinton, which starts from Oakwood and goes all the way over to Peel. So as the subway is built and completed, this will span across 4 subway stops from Oakwood to Fairbank, which is at Dufferin, to Caledonia, and then to Keelsdale, which is at Keel. So, you know, now as an adult, I was watching and hearing more about and reading more about what was happening in the area. Oh, sorry, I'm seeing messages that it's hard to hear. I'm going to try and get a little bit closer. Let me know if that helps with the sound. So yes, just after hearing what was happening in the area, you know, hearing about the Black businesses and some of the Black residents being forced out of the area over time, and some of the issues being caused by the construction of the subway that's been ongoing for many years, and then now with all of this further exacerbated by the pandemic developments. So for a while now, like probably over 2 years, I had been wondering, you know, who's working on this? Like, isn't somebody doing anything about this? You know, are community groups doing something to stop the fear? Like, what was feared is that over time, the cultural identity of the area would be completely eroded as a result of the gentrification, which has already started, you know, to occur, and which will be ongoing and only increase over time. I wasn't aware when I started my project last year that there were groups operating in the area, and many of you might have heard about the group called Black Urbanism Toronto, and they've been very successful in getting the city of Toronto to focus on supporting businesses and residents in the area. Sorry, I'm trying to get closer because I'm getting messages that my sound is not good. So hopefully this will help now. Yeah, I started my project, which was really with the goal of trying to create ownership in the area. From my point of view, it seemed obvious that some of the issues in the area couldn't be completely solved, but, you know, hopefully addressed partially at least by just creating ownership. And so I started the project to try and create a co-ownership structure, a legal structure, to bring together people in the community to invest in property along Eglinton West in that whole strip. So basically looking for the standard or typical commercial mixed-use building that would exist along Eglinton. So, you know, along the way, after I started the project and developed the model with the help of my main and first investor, my anchor investor, I came up with a model that allowed for a low minimum entry point. It was very important to me to be able to include, you know, the average person from the community in the project. So there's a minimum entry point of $10,000. People can invest in multiples of 10,000. Of course, I have to balance that out by also trying to attract investors who would invest larger amounts as well, and really with the idea of managing the number of investors per building. So there's a fine balance there that has to be maintained. And also as part of the project, there's an educational component to it as well. I have the sense, that these types of arrangements like joint venture partnerships or like syndicated real estate investing, it is occurring, kind of quietly in many communities, but I didn't think that it's necessarily happening as much as maybe it's needed in my own community. So that's why I wanted to put this together. But as people join, and for the less experienced investors, there's a hope that I can bring them along for the ride in terms of having people learn about what it takes to manage this type of a building through quarterly meetings and updates. So I had purchased the first building in 2020, although that particular building didn't work out largely because of timing issues, and I've been regrouping for the last several weeks, just trying to put together processes and structures in place that would help to manage the timelines on the next try, and also help to manage the number of investors involved. And also, I've just been trying to build a team of people around me who can just help move this forward. So that's basically the project. Hopefully I have enough time. I can just get into a little bit of the challenges. Do I have time to keep going? I think looks like someone's saying yes. Okay.
Mark, you're on mute.
Briefly go right ahead.
Okay, so really the main challenges are just managing the timing, working with multiple investors, and also just trying to manage the timing that's needed on with the current market being as it is. A lot of people, there have been developers already working in the area, acquiring properties, and then trying to compete with the MLS. The flow that's required to compete with MLS listings is a bit challenging. So that's what I'm trying to work on managing now. Also, with these purchases, as obviously Dina touched on the pricing in Toronto. So with such high entry points, it is challenging to generate returns for investors. And so with the first building, I had looked at a co-living model, which would generate additional revenue. There were two 3-bedroom units. So on a 3-bedroom, that can generate significant additional revenue over time. But yeah, I have to kind of be creative to be able to generate returns for investors. And also, I guess, just knowing where, another challenge is just kind of knowing where to get help in terms of finding any kind of support that would help to, maximize returns for investors over time. Just looking for things like, lower interest loans that could help with, with that, and, grants or whatever it is that could help out with any of the costs involved in closing potentially. Just trying to find any way to squeeze any benefit out of the project as I go along to help with investors, because really, it's not attractive to every single investor. It's really I've been attracting people who are willing to go in for the long haul, where I have to ask for at least a 10-year minimum entry. And as it's not everyone's ideal investment, but it is attracting people who are willing to want to own and want to help and support build.
All right. Martine, we'll probably circle back to you because I think it's fascinating that you're actually working in this area that clearly presents challenges and will continue to present challenges to many. And in that regard, we're going to move over to Alex. Alex, as you are deeply implanted within the community and the communities that you and the United Way work within, what we wanted to talk a bit, or have you talk about, is essentially, this whole concept will be dependent on many things, but one of the most important will be building trust within a community, trust that might lead to a community being willing to invest within that community. And so we wanted to talk to you a bit about, how one dispels suspicion and gives community members comfort to invest in these kind of initiatives, how we build the bridges to create a consensus. And you might wrap up by referring to ILEO as in terms of the work it does. So with that, Alex, take it away.
Great, thanks, Mark. So I'll maybe just start off by saying a little bit about why we're really excited to be here at United Way. I think COVID has exposed the fact that in order to weather crises, we need a really strong social safety net, and the whole principle behind community wealth building initiatives and strategies is that by supporting people to actually have assets, that helps them to weather the kinds of financial ups and downs that they may have, which is why these kinds of models are really important. United Way traditionally funds housing and homelessness programs, so funding to agencies that run supportive housing programs, supportive housing units, and things like that. But we also try to fund the kind of like local systems change initiatives that can make a difference in a community. So, Mimi will talk about her work, and we fund the Working Women organization that she's with. We also provide funding to Park and agencies like that that are exploring land trusts and community wealth building strategies. So this is really an interesting topic for us to talk about at the intersection of social purpose real estate and community wealth building. So to answer Mark's specific questions about like how do we engage community, build trust, build bridges, it made me think of a couple of different things. I think, when we're talking about these kinds of, innovative projects or pilot projects, it's really important that we try to understand the conditions in the local community. So a lot of times when I'm talking to folks about different ideas that they might have, and those might be people that are more familiar with the community or less familiar with the community that they want to try to do some good work in. I think we always try to point people to the fact that the community isn't just like a series of maps. It's not just, a narrative that might be in the media. And so it's important that people really try to build authentic relationships with some of the stakeholders in the community. At United Way, we really think that community service organizations, nonprofits, local neighborhood centers, local resident groups that are taking action on issues, like those are the folks that are really the change makers in community. They convene the spaces where these kinds of issues and opportunities are talked about. And they have a long history of galvanizing local support around different projects and also understanding the specific community needs in those areas. So I think those are really important practices to come into this work with, and those trusted intermediaries, whether it's agencies or community leaders, can really be helpful in not just kind of promoting something, but actually helping to inform it and shape it. I think Dina in her remarks earlier talked about how, the TAP didn't necessarily give us like the roadmap or the one specific answer, and that these kinds of ideas that are innovative should change and grow and develop and respond to the local conditions. And so I think, another reflection would be that like that openness to working with stakeholders so that you understand the need and then match the need to what the intervention that you're trying to do is really important. So, be open to that messy process of like figuring out how this works specifically in that local community. I'll maybe say one or two other points, Mark, and then you can cut me off. Yeah. Okay.
Just fascinating. We want to hear as much as we can from all of you. Go ahead, Alex.
Great. So I think that we really want to recognize, like when we're piloting this kind of stuff, that the community has probably already talked about some of these things already. And also really recognize what the environment in the community is like at that moment, like what some of the tensions might be. So, I'm working with a number of agencies on different ideas related to housing. And, you know, for example, if there's been a lot of displacement that's been happening in that community, you know, Dina talked about just how, you know, apartment buildings have been bought up in the city over the last number of years, and so on. So if you're planning to work in a community and that's what's happening in the community in real time, or there's been a significant shock to the community of that nature, it's why it's so important to lay the groundwork and the foundation of building those relationships to understand what the context is that you're trying to work within. I'll say one last thing just on another project that we're working on before I think I transition back to Mark and Mimi. So we are working on something called the Inclusive Local Economic Opportunity Project in the Golden Mile, in parallel to some of the good work that Mimi and her team is doing. And you know, one of the community wealth building projects there is a joint venture. So it's not entirely related to housing. It's a construction jobs joint venture, but the principles are very similar in how we approach building consensus, how we approach building trust, and the idea that community ownership is central to the work. So in that case, it's a 51% majority owned community construction firm in partnership with ACON. So I'm really excited to see how this particular idea can grow and develop over time. And I'll turn it back to Mark.
Thank you, Alex. And we will also circle back. But you gave a nice segue to Mimi, because you referred to the Golden Mile Project, and Mimi has a wonderful title, the Impact Project Facilitator, and I think that's something that she has to explain. And but I think increasingly that capacity or similar titles for people involved in the community and the impact of projects will increasingly become part of the development vocabulary. So it would be very interesting to hear from Mimi to describe her role and describe, you know, with the involvement of an individual like herself, how does that make this project different from others based on your involvement? And, you know, is the community equity model something that could or should be considered in the later stages of this project? So carry on, Mimi.
Thank you so much, Mark. Great introduction. Further to your question about impact project. So I'll give you, impact is really about how it's multi-layered. So how the transformative development of the Golden Mile is impacting residents, but also how the project can impact residents positively, not just as a passive form of we are having the development here. So I'm going to get right into, if somebody could show the map. I just want to illustrate the large size of this particular project. So we were working in parallel with the Golden Mile Secondary Plan. You can see the study area right here. This is our reference point. It covers 113 hectares, is surrounded by 3 neighborhood improvement areas. And this is generally big box. So a lot of parking lot. And in the case of the northeast corner where my organization, Victoria Park, is located, Victoria Park Hub at Victoria Park and Eglinton, it's a great location for seagulls. So when I see this parking lot, I can see a future that is animated with people. And in terms of the developments that are existing there, there are 12 major development applications. I'm going into a little bit of a planner speak here. It includes major real estate investment trusts such as RioCan, Smart Choice, Smart Centers, Choice, Dream, and KingSet. And I think this kind of circles back into what we were talking about in terms of investment. Investment not only for the shareholder, but also investment in the people who exist there. And that, I think, speaks heavily to community benefits and who are the appropriate investors for us to be targeting when we try to leverage investment for the community. So the initiative was seeded in 2018 by 4 founding nonprofits. And what they started out with was wanting to prevent themselves from being priced out of the real estate. They also extended that into what are the opportunities that are available, community centers, recreation centers, and how do we, and ultimately, how do we leverage the private investment that's coming in here? And the timing for all of this is right. As the audience probably knows, the timing is right. There's been a lot of uptake in social purpose real estate in Toronto. There was a study done by Royal Bank of Canada in 2020, and it was a survey of 800 international institutional investors. And what they found was over half of Canadian investors believe that corporations with a triple bottom line or a corporate social responsibility strategy perform better than those without. Also, they also found that Canadian investors believe heavily in an alignment between corporate values and public policy objectives, and were one of the first who would be willing to pull out if there was not an alignment, say a scandal or something strongly misaligned. So I think those are really good motivating factors. Just getting back to what Alex had mentioned earlier on about the role of the nonprofit sector in bridging the gap. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I want to give you an example on the ground of, say you have an immigrant who comes from a militarized authoritarian regime. They're coming to the country not only with lack of knowledge of democratic process, but also the barrier of cultural norms and knowledge. So you actually have 3 barriers for that person to participate. And that participation is not only in the planning process, but also in, I would say, investment and what they feel is their entitlement to invest in, and their investment in community wealth. And that, I think it could be explored further, maybe in a psychological study, but I believe that that is a barrier on multiple levels. One thing that I found was very interesting that came out of some of our work was community space. And this is speaking a little bit more to your question. What we found was there was some tension between for example, the lack of policy that supports nonprofits to currently advocate for affordability. For example, in a leasing scenario, they're just considered to be a commercial leaser. And also in the community wealth, there's just a lack of structure. So I'm going to speak a little bit more to the question that you had asked about the different models. I do think that there is an opportunity to apply the models that were discussed by Dina Glazier and Martine, like for example, community homeownership. There is, based on the work that we did in the Golden Mile, we identified 3 priorities, and certainly a move towards homeownership would have to be tied in with the intersection of community nonprofits to translate some of that financial knowledge. And I think this might even be an opportunity to take a look at it, financial knowledge and investment hand in hand with capacity building around planning and development processes. So that's the first thing I would want to put out there. The second thing is, say, cornerstone rental equity, and sort of like a small scale development, something to help renters in their existing state. I think this might be something that you might want to start with, because it's sort of like your low-hanging fruit. The only downside to something like a strategy like that would be, say, funding sources for continuity and sustainability of supporting renters. I don't know how's my time looking, Mark?
Well, if you have a few more things you'd like to say to wrap up your portion, go ahead and say them.
Okay, sure. I think any of the four models could be discussed and possibly, further analysis and adoption to look at what's happening in the Golden Mile. Of the 12 developments that are happening, there's really one that's fairly ready, and then a larger master plan, which is the Choice REIT site. And that is, those are the two big ones. The others are more at a site plan, kind of moving towards, I'd say a site plan kind of level. So what I'm saying is that there's room for discussion. Things have been already decided in terms of maybe say units, general site master plan design, but I believe there is room for further discussion. Maybe this community home ownership model could be talked about. Commercial for sure. I think just given that the majority of developments in the area are not making it to even the prescribed required 10% non-residential in the area. I think that speaks to how do we get them there? I think the question is, how do we get them there to the table? And I don't think I have time for the strengths and weaknesses of the project, but that's my wrap up right there.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. And thank all of you. Shortly, we will get into some of the questions. I had hoped we might get into a little dialogue, but there's precious little time. Nonetheless, I would ask two things. Dina, perhaps you can come back and join us visually and audially. And just in your listening to the three panelists, I just wonder if there's something specific that you might like to bounce off of them or ask them. I think what Dina and I, by the way, and through previous discussions, both during the TAP and some follow-up, ultimately what we were trying to determine is, does this idea of investment in a community of this nature have legs? Is this something that really can and should happen here? And I don't know, Dina, whether you wanted to add to that thought, but or whether there's something specific you might like to glean from these people before we turn it over to the audience. If not, that's fine too.
Let's start with that thought, and then I have another question if we've got time. But
yeah, go ahead. So the question to the three of you is there something here? Or are the obstacles too enormous from your experience? Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's something definitely here. I think it's part of why I've really appreciated participating in the dialogue and hearing about how this idea has been evolving and feedback from different stakeholders. It's a complex idea with a lot of with a lot of possible objectives. Like, I think what we had some real interesting conversation about is like, how do you find that sweet spot of interest from the local community? Like, what is the thing that they value? What's the thing that they want to preserve? So that could be like treasured, like local commercial space with, Martine mentioned in her remarks, like just people have a history of like, what were those shops that you always went to when you were younger, or those mainstays in a community, right? Like that would actually motivate a lot of local community members of different income brackets to want to participate in this kind of a community wealth building activity. So I think, the openness that Dina and others have had around, it might be housing, it might be arts and cultural or nonprofit space, it might be a local commercial storefronts. Like, I think that's an important thing that that we can kind of test with community and kind of a next step, and help to kind of refine the idea a little bit more. But I think there's a big appetite for this. Yeah.
Do you agree, Martine and Mimi?
Yes, I think I would add to that and look at the specific models. I just jotted down a few notes. The hyper-local REIT, for example, I think that would be a very interesting one to explore because we have so many REITs in the Golden Mile. Maybe even something where a more established REIT could partner with a newer REIT or like this kind of nonprofit local REIT idea to create the structure and then provide guidance. And then partner and then bringing in the nonprofit sector to help to make those connections. But I mean, again, I really think given the knowledge gap, I really think that the financial literacy piece is very key, especially for starting off and even to do like maybe barriers research and to understand what are the limitations and what are the worries. Because, you know, in the pandemic, for example, we really saw nonprofit, and Alex spoke to this as well, the nonprofits themselves going right back to basic services. So right away, you've got resources that have been shipped over to the emergency situation. That's not always going to be the case, but that has happened. And we can see, one, the strength of nonprofits being nimble, but also being a weakness because they have to be moving and shifting that way based on their funding. So really understand that gap, understanding and addressing that gap in knowledge would be key. And then the second one that I was looking at here was the renter equity, because we've noticed that housing or affordable housing is one of the major priorities of marginal or traditionally racialized residents, that addressing their immediate need, like $100 as an investment would be something they could start out with just to gain an appetite for investment. You know, and I think you got to start somewhere. You know, $10,000, maybe a more established person, maybe somebody who has gotten a great job building the LRT or building for Daniels, you know. Anyways, I'm going to stop there, but those are my ideas.
Martine, before I come back to you, I'm just going to ask the question of Alex. Do we have a number of questions? Do we have some questions we could go with from the audience?
Mark, I can jump in, and we do have a couple of questions that are quite intriguing if we want to take them. Maureen Fair asks.
Can you forego your question for a moment, Dina, and we'll take one from the audience?
Was that okay? Would you like to do that? Maureen's asking, I haven't much yet heard from the speakers about the role of government. So from a municipal planning and inclusionary zoning to the federal national housing strategy, these government interventions in the market haven't made any significant progress. What is one thing that the feds could do that they aren't currently doing?
Well,
anybody want to grab that?
Can I just raise something that was discussed? Something that was discussed at the TAP was the need for an acquisition and preservation fund, right? And I think it was Lori-Ann Gervin who asked CMHC to put that under the tree for Christmas. It was a pre-Christmas TAP, because one of the things that's so challenging is that we're losing out of the back door many more spaces than we're building in the front. So there's been a huge focus on building a new affordable housing in particular, and that's incredibly important. But if we're losing 15 times as much out the back as we're building up the front, then where's the strategy for preservation? I think that was one of the things that we talked about as a hole that government could fill.
Good.
Jumping on that, and I know you'll like this one, Dina, there's a question about whether this initiative and this model was to address existing built space or new built space. And I know preserving existing assets was a priority when you began. So any comments in that regard from the panel on that question?
Dina, I think, again, that's probably something you can address.
Well, I'll start with that by saying my instinct really was about preservation first and foremost, and then expansion after that. And preservation, because it seems like there's a lot of great buildings just getting lost, and with them affordable housing, retail, and commercial and community space. So that was really my my first instinct, is let's hold on to what we've got now and figure out how we hold on to it and maintain it and operate it in concert with community members who then can also benefit from the ongoing operation and maintenance of those buildings. But the other panelists may have a view. I think, Martine might have something to say on this too.
Definitely, yes. I would agree with Dina completely that preservation of the existing buildings is very important, especially as that goes hand in hand with trying to maintain, the current tenants and business owners, especially in the area that I'm focusing on. I also just wanted to go back to the previous question, if I may, which was, is there something to this? And I just want to say, my approach has been very grassroots. And, I basically found investors like one at a time through referrals and just talking to people one on one. And, I've talked to many people since I started this last fall. And I can tell you based on the response that I'm getting, even for people who don't, decide to invest for whatever reason, the feedback that I've been getting is like, it's just outstanding. And people definitely believe in this concept and they want to see it succeed. And they want to have examples of how to do this. And I think that's part of what's lacking. It's just like, at least in my community, just people having examples of, how to go about this kind of thing. Like I thought them out and they are there. There are these types of examples, but for people who aren't looking for it, it's hard to be aware of it, people be aware of what people are doing. So.
Thank you. Laura, I think that you also were going to wrap up. I don't know whether we have time for any more questions before you wrap up. I don't think we do.
Well, in fact, I was going to suggest, Mark, maybe you take the time to ask another question that would be of interest, or Dina. You're right. We only do have 4 or 5 minutes remaining. Other than saying thank you, I mean, I'm more interested in hearing, if we can get a few more tidbits of perspective from this great lineup.
Dina, why don't you ask the question that you wanted to ask earlier?
Well, I think Mimi partially answered it, in fact, because I was going to ask the panelists about the importance of financial literacy. One of the things that we discussed at the TAP was that number of these models. For example, the hyper-local REIT. Mimi, I love the idea of the local REIT. That's actually what inspired me to start a lot of this research. But, handing somebody a prospectus or, the kinds of financial information that you need to sign up for when you sign into a REIT is not simple. So I was interested in, and I think Martine, you also have made financial literacy part and parcel of your business model. So I was just going to ask how we overcome that barrier, along with the other kinds of barriers that you noted, Mimi, when you were talking about how somebody comes to this country and there's a cultural barrier, there's a knowledge barrier, there might be a language barrier, right?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty long discussion, but if I could circle back to your last question, I would say prioritizing affordability may offer an opportunity for saving some of those existing spaces that you're talking about, like focusing on affordability and making sure that those services that pre-existed also come back. I mean, it might be a smaller retail space, it might be a kiosk or whatnot, but just preserving some of that spirit even. That might be an answer. And yeah, the barriers, I really think that the nonprofits who are embedded in the community have a very strong role to play in all of this.
Thank you. And Laura, I think I'll turn it back to you to wrap us up here.
Yeah, I mean, from what I was able to take away from today's session, it sounds like, the model, if a model can exist, it has to have sort of the dynamics to be hyper-localized to each community that it's going to go into. And it might need to look for, a multi-pronged model where there are definitely partners or pieces that bring in those components, like the financial literacy, like the community rep or partner who can act as that liaison, who has that great background knowledge, as you were saying, Alex, to, know what has transpired here and what community might be receptive to or not. And then you bring in sort of the proposition or the offer of investment. So definitely a complex model. As Dina mentioned in the 2-day TAP, we really heard from those panelists that, hey, is a model even possible, or does it have to be, so localized to each context? So continue to debate and gather information. And, you know, Dina, any closing notes? Otherwise, I'm just going to thank everyone for being here today on behalf of ULI, our members, our guests. Hope you got some really interesting information out of the session, and look forward to having you back at some of our upcoming events. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.